Morning, everyone.
Morning.
So this is our last class, just so that everyone is aware. So this is the end. Oh, but I labeled it as number 4. That doesn't make any sense. It's number 5, in case you were wondering. I guess I got excited there when I was changing the title. So what we're going to do then, since this is our last one, is we're going to span from the early 1900s all the way up to 1947. So that's the plan, which means I have 87 slides. Which if you work that out, that comes to, I need to change the slide right now. So here's the other thing too is I don't know what happened up there. There we go. All right. So this is what we're going to look at. First, we're going to take a look at the British response. So this is really the aftermath of World War I. So we'll be looking at the Balfour Declaration. Then we'll look at prompting from Germany. This is a little piece of history that not a lot of people are aware of, but the Germans actually helped a number of Jews immigrate to Palestine, weirdly enough, as part of their war effort to undermine Britain. That's strange, right? So the Germans thought, that Jews are parasites and that they ruin places, right? So they said, if we can get more to Palestine, then we'll mess up the British Empire. So they actually save a lot of Jewish lives, weirdly enough. Then we're going to take a look at Israel's connection, ultimately, to the Holocaust and how Israel comes out of that. So that's the plan. This is the main message that I want us to know. Nothing could stop Israel's return. And I find that to be one of the most exciting things about all of this. Right? We've been seeing just kind of the back and forth of the 1800s of which way do we go? What are we going to do? And as we progress in time, the choice becomes so much that there ultimately almost isn't a choice. Right? That God says, no matter who wants to make this stop, it doesn't matter. Right? Britain's going to say, we're going to let in, or we want to create a Jewish homeland. And then they're going to back off of that a little bit. They're going to say, actually, let's stop some immigration. And ultimately, it doesn't matter if you want to stop immigration. Too bad, right? Even the biggest haters of Jews in the world, the Nazis, are then going to be used to make the Jewish immigration happen, right? And I think that's what you see working out of this, that no matter who tries to change things, no matter who tries to make it stop, no matter who tries to get rid of the Jews, God says, no, my people are going to be in the land. Right? And that, to me, is ultimately what we can take from this. Our God speaks, and it is done. Oh, the why question. We didn't look at that. That's really important. I got all excited about the core message. Okay. Why? Here's a weird one, too. Why did Hitler consider giving Madagascar to Jews? So you can think about that. That's real strange, right? And the reason I put that up there is, you remember what we talked about yesterday, right? That Great Britain wanted to give them Uganda. We actually have a parallel sort of thing going on here with Germany. Now, just to make this clear, right? Don't parallel this too much, because we are talking about Nazis, obviously. And it was not going to be like, Uganda was supposed to be a nice place where they could have a country and where they could grow food and all that. That wasn't Hitler's intention, right? It wasn't like, oh, I'll give them a nice little colony sort of thing. That wasn't the idea. But it is just interesting to see that both Great Britain and Germany looked to Africa as a place for Jews to go. Okay, so let's pick up the story just after World War I. This is the result of what's called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. So World War I ends in what year?
1919.
Was it 1919? I thought it was 1918. Yeah, okay. All right, 1918. Oh, now I started to question myself here. Okay, so the Sykes-Picot Treaty comes out, right? And what it deals with specifically is what do we do with the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Empire has fallen apart, so we're just going to divide it up. So take a look closely. You have Italy up here. This is the Italian area. Over here is going to be the French area. Down here, this red portion is going to be British. So this is what the Allied powers, this is where they're going to take over. Now, this portion here, look at this carefully. I thought that this was very interesting. This was going to be international. Now, as you might know, even though it was going to be international, it doesn't become that. So in 1922, Britain does get what's called the mandate from the League of Nations to be the power that oversees this particular area. So ultimately, all of this ends up going to Great Britain and to its influence. Now, we are also familiar then with Arthur Balfour and the Balfour Declaration. So I'm not going to talk about him too much because I think we sort of know the deal. Notice, though, that this is November 2nd, 1917, right? So this is actually before the war ends. And what I want us to do is we're actually going to read the Balfour Declaration. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever done that. I will tell you that before putting together these classes, I had not. Right? It was just a thing that, oh, everybody knows the Balfour Declaration, His Majesty's government looks with favor, right? You know, and we know that sort of thing. But it's fascinating to read because there's a whole other section that we often don't look at. And what I want to suggest to you is, unfortunately, that other section really made things hard for the British. And not only really made things hard for them, but made them hard for the Jews. And so a lot of the tension that you see, in fact, results from that second section. So let's just take a look at this. Now, interestingly, the Balfour Declaration happens to have been stuck in a letter. So this is the copy that you always see, written to the Rothschild. It goes like this. I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. Here we go. Quote. Here's the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Now that's the part that we normally quote, right? And you read that and you feel all excited. And the Zionists felt that way too. Because, remember what we saw yesterday with Herzl? Herzl approaches Baron Hirsch and he says, oh, you know, we need to stop Brazil, Argentina, all of it. That doesn't make any sense. And Hirsch is like, you're crazy, you need a plan. So he doesn't get support there. He talks to Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser says, you need a plan. Like, don't talk to me. This is the first time that a world power, and Britain, right, the most powerful world power at the time, said, yeah, this is a good idea. Right? So Zionists are just blown away by this. They say, this is astonishing. And that's partly why we only read the first section, right? We read it and we get excited and we're like, wow, that's so amazing. I can't believe that happened. But read the second part. And notice, let me just ask you, what do you notice about the second part that makes things difficult? Ready? We're going to start right here. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. All right, so that's part 2 of the Balfour Declaration. Now, what's challenging about that? Basically everything, right? So, number 1, we think a Jewish homeland sounds good, they say. Number 2, but, even though we support this, we're not going to do anything that might prejudice those who are living there right now. Well, yeah, right? Like, how are you going to make a Jewish homeland and be like, oh, don't worry, you know, we're just going to bring in a whole other population here and create a state where you're living, but that doesn't bother you, right? You know, like, that's not going to be a thing. That's not going to happen. And you have all the animosity already between that Arab and Jewish population that was living there. So the whole thing was, unfortunately, it was a very, very challenging goal, right, that Britain has. So yes, this is a big deal that this comes out and says that Great Britain wants to create a Jewish homeland, but it also then, by making the statement, creates the situation where they have to try and adhere to creating a Jewish homeland without upsetting Arabs, which is very, very hard. In fact, the Arab population decided to show them how hard it was. Because Balfour Declaration comes out in 1917. 3 years later, March 8th, you get this. Now, anyone know what this is here? It's Damascus Gate, right? So that's the Damascus Gate, the entrance to the Muslim quarter of the city. And it is where demonstrations always take place, right? So in fact, if you were to look up a modern picture of Damascus Gate, you would notice that there is a watchtower right there where police generally hang out. So demonstrations are often there at the Damascus Gate. Now, this is an initial riot that happens in 1920, March 8th. Now, the key thing is, the British government did not want to see riots. They wanted a stable populace, and they wanted somehow to figure out a Jewish government and yet keep the stability. Now, the issue with this, the reason that this riot happened, you might be able to guess, is because of Jewish immigration. So this was a riot specifically over Jewish immigration, March 8th, 1920. Now, that riot then blossoms into what's called the Nebi Musa riots. So Nebi Musa means Tomb of Moses. And these riots were all part of this. It was part of an Arab holiday where they would all walk to what was called the Tomb of Moses. So they'd all walk there, and they would celebrate this time. Well, the celebration turned into another riot, right? So what you have is the populace was just on its edge, and then March, it explodes again in April. Now consider then the reaction of the British government. The British government is going to say, what's going on? Our goal is to prevent any kind of prejudice. We want these two groups to get along. Now here's a little bit about how the riot goes. This is from Khalil al-Sakini. He was a Christian at the time. So yeah, not totally a non-biased party, but you know, he wasn't one of the factions fighting. But this is what he says. He was a Christian school teacher. A riot broke out. The people began to run about, and stones were thrown at the Jews. The shops were closed, and there were screams. I saw a Zionist soldier covered in dust and blood. Afterward, I saw one Hebronite approach a Jewish shoeshine boy who hid behind a sack in one of the wall's corners next to Jaffa Gate, and take his box and beat him over the head. He screamed and began to run, his head bleeding, and the Hebronite left him and returned to the procession. The riot reached its zenith. All shouted, "Muhammad's religion was born with a sword." I immediately walked to the municipal garden. My soul is nauseated and depressed by the madness of humankind. So this was not the kind of thing that had been happening previously. You know, I think when we think of Jerusalem, we think of it always as being a powder keg, but it wasn't. Not until this declaration that there's going to be this Jewish homeland. And the Arabs start to say, what? You know, what's that about? How's that supposed to work? So here's how the riot goes. If you look right here, this is the Jaffa Gate, and right there is the Tower of David. So the riot goes up and then back, and they end up attacking a British policeman. Right? So this then makes the British very upset about this. Right? Now, they don't get upset with the Arabs. They get upset with the whole situation. Right? And they say, why are these riots happening? And they are told, Jewish immigration. Right? So the British solution is to send this guy. You might recognize him. They send down Winston Churchill to be their representative. This is in 1922, to be their representative in Palestine. Now, it's interesting, Churchill is approached by both the Jewish committee and an Arab delegation. Now, the Jewish committee presents him with all their plans on how they're going to work things out and what they're going to do with the land. And the Arab delegation presents him this. Now, I feel like John's kind of, paving the way for the things I'm going to say, so that it's good. You might have noticed he mentioned the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? So this book has been around since the early 1900s. Nobody knows where it came from. The best guess, it first shows up in Russia, about 1905-ish. So the best guess is that it was forged by the Russian secret police. Now we know it's not real, in terms of, we know it's a forgery. And the reason for that is it's actually based on a book in French called A Dialogue in Hell, in case you're interested in ever checking it out. It's not a very good book. I read it. It's kind of boring. Anyway, it's based on that, and it basically just took these passages out. But because it was written in Russian, they figured, oh, nobody's going to know about this French book, whatever. The book supposedly depicts a meeting between the elders of Zion discussing how they're going to dominate the world. Now, again, these are all just taken straight out of this French book. And the French book is having Montesquieu and, who's the prince guy? Machiavelli. That's who it was. They're discussing. They're supposed to both be in hell, right? Because they were bad, I guess. And they're discussing, how do you rule over a populace, right? So Machiavelli is the prince guy, right? And they're discussing, how do you rule over a populace? And so that dialogue is put into the Jews to talk about, how do you take over the world, right? And so they talk about things like, well, we just have to infiltrate the education system, and we'll teach them all that as Gentiles, they are very unintelligent, but that Jews know everything, right? It's really dumb, the whole thing. So that's what it all goes through like that, right? Well, the Arab delegation took this book and said to Churchill, this is the policy that we want you to know about. We want you to know this is what the Jews are doing. Now, Churchill didn't actually take this seriously. It was actually the Times of London that exposed the forgery in the 1920s. And he also didn't take it seriously because the folder that they gave it to him in misspelled the word Palestine on the front. Right? So he was like, this is just, I can't talk to you guys. Right? So that was how that went down. He does respond, though, to the Arab delegation. And what I want you to notice as we look at this is, we're not going to read this whole thing. We'll just read the first couple of sentences and then the last few sentences on the next slide. But I want you to notice the issue that Churchill runs into. So look at what he says to them. He says, you've asked me in the first place to repudiate the Balfour Declaration and to veto immigration of Jews into Palestine. Again, that's what the riots were about. It is not in my power to do so, nor if it were in my power would it be my wish. So number one, he says, here's the Balfour Declaration. You don't seem to understand. I can't do anything other than what that says. Right? So he says, you've come to me and you've told me no Jew should be allowed to move here. Well, I have a document that says Jews have to live here. Right? I love this next sentence. The British government have passed their word by the mouth of Mr. Balfour that they will view with favor the establishment of a national home for Jews in Palestine. A quote, right? And that inevitably involves the immigration of Jews into the country. Right? He's like, what do I do? Say, oh yeah, we'll make a homeland, but none of you can come. Like, what? So he says, sorry, but that's what the British government said. Now, you'll notice, though, that he doesn't just talk about the first part of the Balfour Declaration. Look at what he says at the end. Here I would draw your attention to the second part of the Balfour Declaration, which solemnly and explicitly promises to the inhabitants of Palestine the fullest protection of their civil and political rights. Now, when we think of Winston Churchill, we think of Churchill who favors the Jews, who does what he can to help the Jews. That's historically who he was. What's odd about this is he's very much stuck in this position between the two parts of the Balfour Declaration, where he needs to create a national homeland, but he can't do anything, right? Unfortunately, the Balfour Declaration, that second part, was very broad. He can't do anything that might prejudice the current inhabitants of the land and make them think that they're being ignored. So, 1922, well, right before that, there's the Jaffa riots, May 1921. Again, you can figure out the cause, Jewish immigration. So in 1922, he publishes this. This is known as the 1922 White Paper. Now, that's what Britain called their declarations about Palestine. Is that something else that they call, like, their parliament's decisions or whatnot? Are those all called white papers? Yeah. Okay. So this. Yeah. It's okay. Okay. Interesting. And so then this is the white paper regarding Palestine in June 1922. So correspondence with the Palestine Arab delegation and the Zionist organization. So this is what he publishes, 1922. And unfortunately, what he does is he says, we will now restrict Jewish immigration. So there hadn't been restrictions on it up until 1922. So Churchill actually stands up and restricts it. Now, he doesn't, like, cut it off, right? But he puts quotas on the Jewish immigration. Now, that same year, December 1922, that is when the League of Nations decides to give Britain the mandate for that area. Remember, it was going to be international? But now it's actually passed on to Great Britain in December 1922 by the League of Nations. Now, what you'll notice is that the mandate is actually based on the Balfour Declaration. And that's an important thing to note, because I think it shows us, number one, how crucial the Balfour Declaration was, and it also shows us that the inability that the Balfour Declaration passed on to people like Churchill continued to be passed on through the League of Nations. Right? Just listen to this. Whereas the principled Allied powers have also agreed that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917, by the government of His Britannic Majesty and adopted by the said powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. There's the quote again. It being clearly understood, oh, see what's happening? That nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So it quotes the whole thing. It then says, therefore, the mandatory shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home, as laid down in the preamble, and the development of self-governing institutions, that's part one, and also, part two, for safeguarding the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. So this, from the Balfour Declaration, ends up in the mandate given to Great Britain. So if you've ever wondered, right, what was going on with Great Britain during the 1920s and during the Holocaust? Like, what's happening? You know, when Great Britain comes along and the UN vote happens in 1947, and it says, Great Britain, and they say, abstain, and you're like, no, you know, what was going on there? It's all the result of this struggle, this tension here, as they're trying to figure out, how do we create a Jewish homeland, and yet, how do you safeguard the civil and religious rights of people who hate the Jews? Right? How are we supposed to do this? And so there's this attempt to be neutral in a situation that's very difficult to be neutral in. Now, this continues to come back to bite them. So let me tell you about these Jerusalem riots in 1929. So things are quiet for the next few years, but in 1925, the beginnings of these riots take place. All right, so this is like 4 years in the making, right? So 1925, here's how it goes. That is the Western Wall. Now, it looks a little different than the Western Wall that we know today, and that has to do with what takes place in 1967 once Israel takes over Jerusalem. But that's the Western Wall. The Arab inhabitants of Jerusalem in 1925 become very frustrated with the Jewish community. Here's why. Because the Jewish community put chairs at the Western Wall. That's the reason. There actually wasn't any other reason. It was because they put chairs there. So they put chairs at the Western Wall. Now you might be thinking, what? Like, why? Why would anybody even care about that? Right? It's nice. Like, you have older people who want to go there to the Western Wall and they want to pray, so you put chairs there so they can sit down. Well, the Arab community said, no, you can't have chairs. The reason you can't have chairs is because you're building something there. That's building something. You're changing this territory, and that belongs to us. Right? You can't do that. So they went to the British commissioner there and said, do you see what the Jews are doing? The commissioner's like, no. You know, what did they do? They put chairs there. And the commissioner's like, yeah, okay. Right? You know, whatever, chairs. Well, the reason that this was such a big thing, so let me show you a picture. I should have organized this slightly differently here. Let me show you a picture of this. There we go. That's what we wanted. Okay. Anybody know what that's called? Aside from scary. Okay. This is called Barak. It's B-A-R-A-Q, Barak. So in Arabic, you'll see it called al-Barak. So al means the. So al-Barak. And what a barak is it is a horse with wings and a woman's head, right? So that's one rendition of it. There's a lot of different ones. Here's how the story goes, right? And this is an important story to understand. So where was Muhammad from, first of all? Anyone know? Medina and Mecca, yes. So those are the two cities. He starts out in Mecca, he moves to Medina, he goes back to Mecca. Yep. So one day while he's in Mecca, he walks outside, and this is there at his door. And he's like, whoa, you know, as anybody would be. You know, what is this? And it says to him, get on my back. Now, he, I guess, was not very skeptical. I don't know. He said, okay. And so he gets on the back, and it flies him off to various sites, right? So it takes him to different places. One of the places it takes him is to Mount Sinai, and he sees where the law was given, all these kind of things. Eventually, it ends up taking him to the Western Wall. And that's an important piece of history here, right? Because, tradition. It's important because we often look at the Western Wall as a Jewish site. The Arabs did not see it that way, right? The Barak takes Muhammad to the Western Wall, not to right there in the plaza. There wasn't a plaza at that time. It actually takes him to the top. It takes him to the top, to the Temple Mount, but at the western portion. And so Muhammad gets off of Barak and says, thank you for taking me here. And he takes the reins and he ties it to the wall. So if you go to the Temple Mount today and you ask your guide, where was the Barak tied to the wall? They have a spot, right? They'll take you over to the western wall and they'll say it was right there. So what then happens is the Dome of the Rock is not there, right? It's not built yet. So Muhammad walks over to the rock, which is where we believe the Holy of Holies was, and he stands on the rock, and all of a sudden, he starts to ascend into the air. Now, Muslim tradition says that the reason that the rock came to a point at one section was because the rock was reaching out to stop him, right? And it tried to grab his feet, but it wasn't fast enough because it was a rock. So it tries to stop him, and he floats up in heaven, and he meets with various people in heaven, in the different portions of heaven, until he gets to the seventh portion of heaven. So he meets with Abraham, he meets with Moses, he actually meets with Jesus too, they say. So he meets with Jesus, and then he ends up in the seventh portion of heaven where he talks to God. And God gives him hundreds of commandments. It's the same kind of thing like with Moses, right? Moses, the Jews say he got 613. So Muhammad gets these hundreds of commandments, and he's like, oh, wow, that's a lot of commandments. So he goes down, and as he's going back down through the different levels of heaven, he meets with Moses, who says, hey, how many commands did you get, right? And Muhammad's like, oh, I got hundreds. And Moses says, yeah, I know, I got 613, right? So they start talking, and Moses says, the problem is that people can't keep that many, right? I tried, and it didn't work very good. So you got to go back up there, and you got to tell God that you need less commands. And Muhammad's like, oh, I don't feel very comfortable with that. And Moses says, well, you need to. It's not going to work out well otherwise. So he says, okay. So he goes back up, and he talks to God and says, I need less commands. So God lessens it, so that it's, just a couple hundred. He goes back down, and Moses says, how many did you get this time? And this whole thing, right? And Moses says, it's still too many, go back. So Muhammad goes back and says, Moses says I need less. So he keeps getting less and less and less, going back and forth, right, with this up and down thing, until he goes to Moses, and Moses says, well, and he says, 5. I got 5. And Moses is like, yeah, all right. 5 will work. So if you've ever heard of the 5 pillars of Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam, that's where that comes from, right? Or that's the traditional story as to where that comes from. So Muhammad then ascends back down onto the Temple Mount, he gets on Barak, and it flies him home. Okay, so that's important to understand because that gives you an understanding of why the Arabs cared about this place, right? They saw it as theirs. This is the wall where Barak was put during one of the most important moments in Islam's tradition, right? So, Jews are now changing it, they said, because they put chairs. Well, the British commissioner is not going to do anything about the chairs. So, nothing happens there. This is what the riot looks like in 1929. Now, the story continues here that as time goes by, it's not just chairs. Right, so the chairs come. Eventually, there's a partition. Now, what's the partition for? Anyone know? Yeah, to divide the men and women, right? So a partition comes up, and the Arabs then, again, go to the commissioner and say, look, didn't we tell you? Chairs lead to now there's a building. And the commissioner's like, a building? Like, what do you mean? And they say, look, a curtain. Right? What's going to be next? They say, see, they're changing all of this. The commissioner again says, okay, all right, fine, right? I'll tell them to get rid of the curtain. So he does. But the damage is done in the relations, right? So the Arabs feel like their holy site is being changed. So this guy, Amin al-Husseini, you saw him in John's class, right? There he is again. Amin al-Husseini, he was the mayor of Jerusalem. He's also called the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He says, you know what, I got a plan. Here's what we're going to do. Right? The Jews, they hang out at the bottom of the wall, right? Well, that gives us an advantage because that means that we're at the top of the wall. So he said, why don't we just start to build the wall a little bit? So you might notice these are the stones from Herod's day, right? They're really big. And then these come from the Ottomans. And then this little line up here That's a little change that gets added in the 1920s. Right? So Amin al-Husseini says, let's go ahead and build the wall some more. Let's build it a little bigger. Now, that's very convenient because if you're going to build the wall, right, and you need to carry bricks and whatnot, what's better to carry bricks but donkeys? So he says, let's get the donkeys over here, right? They'll carry the bricks so that we can build the wall. And then, oh, did you say that one of those donkeys has to go to the bathroom, like use the restroom? Oh, just turn it this way, right? And they stick the donkey so that its rear end is over the wall, the side of the wall. So you have Jews praying, and all of a sudden, guess what lands on them, right? And this becomes the thing. It's not, this isn't a war. This is like what little kids do, right? Like he's like throwing donkey excrement at them. So people are getting hit with this while they're praying. And then he says, oh, and if you accidentally drop some bricks, well, everybody makes mistakes. And so there's Jews who are praying at the bottom of the wall and they get hit with bricks, right? So nobody knows what's going to come falling down from this wall. So the 1929 riots are all poised to go, right? This guy, Joseph Klostner, comes along and he leads a big group, kind of like this, right? This is obviously a modern picture, but he leads a big group going along chanting about how Jerusalem will be theirs, right? And that, clearly does not help things at that time. So he goes around doing that. So everything, it's ready to explode, right? And when things are ready to explode, it's one of the smallest things that causes the issue, right? That makes it. Well, that's how it goes here. There are, at that time, there's a Jewish team playing soccer, and there is an Arab team that's playing soccer. They're in different fields, right? There's a Jewish field and an Arab field. Well, the Jewish team accidentally kicks the ball into the Arab field. And one of the Jewish players says, oh, don't worry, I'll go get it, right? So he goes and he runs over to the Arab field, and people say to him, what are you doing? Why are you on our field? Do you want to take that too? And they stab him, and he dies. Right? Just because he was getting a ball. So the city explodes after that. Here's some telegrams from the Palestine Zionist executive to the Zionist organization in London. It says, Bukharian youth was knifed Saturday in quarrel with Arab. That's from the soccer, right? Died Tuesday night and was buried Wednesday morning. Although we used all our influence, effectuate much earlier burial, large crowd attended funeral. This is a telegram, right? That's why it's a little off. So it says, we just want you to know that this person was killed, right? Okay. Here's 2 days later. It says, serious rioting by Arabs since 1 p.m., though Mufti promised yesterday to quieten the Arabs. Old City cleared, but Arabs spread groups through New City. Latest official casualties, 8 Jews, 3 Arabs. They killed 17 Jews, 10 Arabs seriously wounded, about 45, each lightly wounded. Consider figures themselves show inadequate police action, view Arab aggressors. Pointed this out here. Armored cars, airplanes, brought British officials enrolled. Constabulary curfew being proclaimed. Other places reported quiet. All right, and so then they go on. This is the last telegram. They go on. About 120 get killed on both sides. Not total, so 240 total. So those riots happen. That's the biggest riot out of all of them, right? In the previous ones, 1 or 2 people were killed. This now, 120 on each side. So Great Britain then says, okay, this has to stop. Right? We can't have you freaking out about chairs, about a screen, having your donkeys poo on people that are praying. Like this is just ridiculous. And then rioting and killing each other and killing a kid who gets a soccer ball, right? Or they would have said a football. But this just doesn't even make any sense. So they put together what's called the Report of the Commission on the Palestine Disturbances of August 1929. This is what's called the Shaw Commission. And the Shaw Commission is supposed to investigate why did these riots happen. And they do so. You can read it there. But essentially, what they come down to is the Shaw Commission says these riots happen because too many Jews are immigrating. And we have therefore overstepped our bounds because the Arab community feels as though we've taken away their rights. Right? Part 2 of the Balfour Declaration. That's the Shaw Commission. What they then recommend is they say, let's get an expert in political theory, to go down and interview people in Palestine. Let's have him live there for a few months, interview people, so that he can really understand if that's actually the case, right? We tried to put together quickly the information that we saw, but we want to make very informed decisions. So they choose this guy, John Hope Simpson, to go travel down in Palestine for a few months. He does so, and he writes this: Palestine, Report on Immigration, Land Settlement, and Development in 1930. Now, what's fascinating is he goes and he interviews all these people, right? So what comes just before this quote is all these quotations. He has this big long list of quotations that he says are from Zionists. Now, the quotations are Zionists saying, we're just happy to be here. We're happy to do whatever to create peace. Right? We'll live happily with the Arabs. We just don't want them having their donkeys going to the bathroom on us while we pray. Right? Things like this. And he's got a bunch of these quotes saying, we're going to bring peace. Now, do you see the first word of the next paragraph? He follows up all the quotes with, actually, the result of the purchase of land in Palestine by the Jewish National Fund has been that land has been extraterritorialized. It ceases to be land from which the Arab can gain any advantage either now or at any time in the future. Not only can he never hope to lease or to cultivate it, but by the stringent provisions of the lease of the Jewish National Fund, he is deprived forever from employment on that land. So he goes through and he says, here's what the Zionists say, right? We'll work with the Arabs, we're happy to share land with the Arabs, and then he says, actually, they're not. Right? They're just going to buy it all. So he says they're going to go through, buy it all, and Arabs will have no land. That's his conclusion. So he sums up by saying, here's what we see, right? Okay, the Zionists, all these arguments are thoroughly logical. Right? Zionists have reasons that they want to be here. They're logical. They have a basis in fact. They are, however, irrelevant in view of the provisions of Article 6 of the Mandate, meaning Part 2 of the Balfour Declaration, right? The principle of the persistent and deliberate boycott of Arab labor in the Zionist colonies is not only contrary to the provisions of that article of the Mandate, but it is in addition a constant and increasing source of danger to the country. So, what's the solution, John Hope Simpson? To stop Jewish immigration. Right? That's what he says. Now, that's a big policy change, right? How do you do that with the Balfour Declaration? So, the government says, well, we can't say that. We can't just stop it. So why don't we have another expert go and take a look before we issue another white paper? So they do so. That's Lord Pasfield. He then, in October 1930, makes the statement of policy by His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom. He goes along and he says, okay, here's the history, right? We had the 1929 Commission, the Shaw Commission. Then we had William Hope Simpson. I think I called him John Hope Simpson. Anyway, whatever. Simpson was his last name, and Hope was his middle. Oh, John Hope. Well, there you go. John Hope Simpson. Okay, so he goes through, and he essentially says, we've done all these things. Shaw Commission, Simpson's report, and he says, and all these things are right. So therefore, the new determination of Great Britain is that we will curtail Jewish immigration to a trickle. And so in 1930, Great Britain almost entirely cuts off immigration. Now, remember, the Balfour Declaration had been passed or had been made only 13 years prior, right? So this ignites a huge debate in Parliament. Right? People were saying, you can't just do this. Right? We have this document, we have the mandate that we are supposed to create a Jewish homeland. And so, MacDonald, who I believe was the prime minister at the time, but I don't know that entirely. I'm questioning myself here. Oh yeah, it was. Look, 10 Downing Street. There we go. Good thing I know my British addresses. Okay, so he writes a letter and says, Dear Dr. Weizmann, right? So he's now writing to Chaim Weizmann, who became the head of the Zionists after Theodor Herzl dies. Right? So the whole Uganda thing happens, Theodor Herzl goes into depression because of it, and he dies very shortly thereafter. Chaim Weizmann then takes over the Zionist organization. MacDonald writes to him, and he says, I just want you to know, you're very upset about what's just happened in Great Britain. And understandably so. I'm very upset too. So he writes this letter that says, I want you to understand that we don't actually mean it. And this is a big deal, right? What do you do when the government comes out and says, our policy is to restrict Jewish immigration to a trickle, and then the prime minister writes a letter saying, we don't actually agree with that? It's like, oh, this is interesting. So it becomes this very strange kind of push and pull. Well, at that time, there had definitely been a change, right? So you can see, you can understand somewhat why the Arabs were getting afraid, right? They were recognizing, oh, things are changing. In 1922, when Churchill first came, you had 89% Arab, 11% Jewish. 1931 is 83% Arab, 17% Jewish. So the numbers are changing. Great Britain they do have the MacDonald letter, but immigration gets highly limited. Now, this is now the 1930s, right? When does Hitler become Chancellor of Germany? 1933, January 30th. January 30th, 1933. These are his election posters from 1932. Unsere letzte Hoffnung means our last hope, Hitler. So he runs for president of Germany in 1932. He loses, but he comes in second. In fact, he comes in so close that they have to have a second election. Hindenburg, that's this guy over here, is the one who wins, and he was the incumbent. He was also a World War I general, so that's why he's dressed like that. He decides that because Hitler came in second, that he could form the strongest possible government by bringing Hitler on as the Chancellor of Germany. So Hindenburg actually appoints Hitler as the Chancellor. This is a really interesting sort of thing, and I'll only say a little bit about it because I have 87 slides. But what's happening here is Hitler originally tried to seize power in Germany. Right, 1923, he has the beer hall putsch and he gets arrested for it. From that moment on, he decides that he is only going to get power legally, right? Only through legal methods. Now, what that means is he often gets into a government organization and changes the laws so that he can do it legally. But everything that he does here is legal. Right? He becomes Chancellor of Germany in a completely legal method. Okay, that's January 30th, 1933. Now, immediately, Berlin starts to have anti-Jewish measures. So Jews who are doctors, they can't work as doctors anymore. Jews who are part of the civil service, they can't do that either. So that takes place specifically in Berlin. The first nationwide attack against the Jews is April 1st, 1933. And so that's where you get Nazi soldiers standing outside of Jewish shops saying things like, Germans, defend yourselves against Jewish atrocity propaganda, buy only at German shops. So this is the nationwide boycott. It actually was very unsuccessful. So a lot of people just said, what is this? Like, boycott Jewish shops for a day? This is silly. I just want to buy milk. You know, like, get out of my way. I'm going to go in the shop. There's a really good picture, but I couldn't find it, of an old lady pushing a German soldier to the side so that she can get in. Like, get out of my way. I got to get my stuff. Okay, so this isn't all that successful. But what I want you to show, or what I want to show here through this, is that Nazi policy isn't what we always imagined, or what we generally today imagine the Nazis being. I think we think of the Nazis and we think of the death camps, right? We think of this machine that processed people, right? That just killed people, and that was what the Nazis were all about. It was what they were all about in the 1940s. But in the 1930s, they hadn't quite figured that out yet. And that's an important piece to understand, right? They knew they hated Jews. Hitler wrote about it in Mein Kampf in the 1920s, but they didn't know what to do about Jews, despite the fact that they hated them. So the 1930s are a very interesting period because what you see when you look at the way that Nazis work with Jews is you see them experimenting and trying different things, like this. This didn't work, right? So they end up doing other stuff. Nevertheless, at that same time, 6 days after the boycott, right? So Nazi Germany is making it clear, we're going to do something against the Jews. We don't really know what yet, but this is what it's going to look like. The British cabinet says, April 7th, 1933, the number of Jewish refugees who could be allowed to enter, that's Palestine, is strictly conditioned by what the country can absorb. There is no reason to suppose that room could be found in Palestine in the near future for any appreciable number of German Jewish refugees. Right? We have the white paper. It's not changing. There's no place for them to go. Now, what's weird about that is to contrast that with what the Nazis said. Now, keep in mind, the Nazis were anti-Jewish, but their big concern at this point was, how do you get the Jews out of Germany? Because they felt that Jews were parasites, right? They go into your country, they attach to it, they become high up in the country, and then they take it over. Right? That was how they felt. So they said, if we can just get them out of Germany, then that's going to be pretty good. So this is Johann von Leers. It's a picture of him. You can see very clearly that he was a Nazi. Here's what he says. The fundamental idea of the Zionists to organize the Jews as a nation among nations in their own land is sound and justified. Did you ever think you'd read a Nazi saying that? Right? Like, that's crazy. Now, you can see the Nazi part, right? As long as it is not connected with any plan for world domination. If Israel takes up the plow, the hoe, and the scythe, and is no longer intent on making other nations its servants, and wants instead to be a free nation among free nations and develop its productive power to the same extent that it developed its demonic powers, it will find friends where before it only found enemies, and Israel and its neighbors will greet each other across freshly plowed fields. Right? That's a crazy quote. Number one, like, because of these things about world domination and their demonic powers and all that, right? But also because, like, here's a Nazi coming along and saying, oh, I totally get Zionists. You know, Zionists, they have nationalism. That's what we have, right? It makes sense. They want their own state. That's what we want, right? We understand. And if they go and they decide to do that, build their own state, we're all for that. Just get them out of Germany. Right? That was the feeling. And so, what that leads to is this. This is called the Havurah Agreement. So the Havurah Agreement was an agreement between the Zionist Federation, which was the Yishuv, led by David Ben-Gurion in Palestine, and the Nazi Party, Nazi Germany. Now, this agreement, it was not like the Yishuv wanted to do this, right? I should make that clear. They saw the writing on the wall. So what they did in the Havurah Agreement is the Zionist Federation said, we want the Jews into Palestine. We want them out of Germany. And Germany said, well, that's great. We want them out of Germany too. So let's make a deal. We'll let them out. And we'll help them get there if you're willing to take them. But here's how it's going to work. Right? Germany always made its own terms. So it said, here's how it works. Every Jew who wants to go to Palestine sells everything they own. They sell it here in Germany to benefit the German economy. They then use that money and they buy German goods to benefit the German economy. So everything you own is sold. Your house, if you had a car, right? Any of that stuff. It's sold, German goods are bought, German economy goes up, and then those goods, a portion of those goods, are also sold to Palestine. And that money that is made from those goods is used to purchase your ticket to send you to Palestine. So you arrive in Palestine with nothing, right? You leave all the goods that you bought, and those are given to Germany. So this is the Havurah Agreement. Now, it stank, right, for Jews. This was a terrible situation, a terrible organization to be able to get things from. But it actually saves tens of thousands of lives, which is crazy, right, to think about. So here's one of the certificates of somebody who did it. Havurah Limited. This is somebody from New York. This is their remittance to Germany. Who's supporting it? This is somebody from Northern California who was writing about how they did it in 1937. And so, to prove how friendly they were to the Jews, the Nazis minted a coin about the Havurah. Now, by the way, this is really good to know about because this shows up in a lot of anti-Jewish propaganda, right? Particularly with those who want to say that Israel is the new Nazis, right? What do you do about a coin with a Star of David and a swastika? And a lot of people can't read it, right? So they see it and they're like, wow, we knew it, right? The Jews are Nazis. So it's important to know the historical basis of this and to understand this is actually for the purpose of saving people's lives, right? Yes, this was collaboration with the enemy, but people lived because of it. So this is what Chaim Weizmann says about it, 1933. He says, I think everyone would prefer to do without it. Yeah. But unfortunately, it's a Hobson's choice, meaning it's between two bad choices. We have to get as much of the property of Jewish immigrants out of Germany as we can, and since the export of money is out of the question, goods are all we can export. So we have to buy these German goods, yes, putting money into the German economy, but we're saving people. And so what happens, because of the Havarah, like this is crazy to me, right? The British had stopped immigration. All of this is illegal immigration facilitated by Germany, by Nazi Germany, getting past the British. And look, it was 19%, right, in 1933? It's 34% in 1936. Now, the British get very frustrated about this, right? There's all this bypassing of their immigration laws. So in 1939, they issue another white paper, which puts even more stringent quotas. Because it then says, in the next 5 years, here's your number. Right before you had a yearly quota. And if you didn't meet the quota, you know what, I'm not going to say, I don't remember how it went. Anyway, they give a quota for 5 years, and this becomes a very, very, very stringent immigration policy of May 1939. So the Germans actually decide that they need a new plan. This is the craziest part about the story. Have you heard of Adolf Eichmann before? Right? Arrested in Argentina. Right? John mentioned him, but he talked about him as Ricardo Clement because he was given that alias by the Catholic Church. Right? So the Catholic Church helps him run away. He gets to Argentina. He's captured by the Mossad in 1960, and the Mossad brings him back where he's hung in 1962. Now, he was responsible for implementing the final solution. So he was at the Wannsee Conference in 1942. If you've heard about that, the Wannsee Conference figures out what are we going to do for the final solution of the Jewish problem. They come up with the death camps, and then they give the information to Adolf Eichmann, and they say, figure out how to make that happen. And he does. So the responsibility for 6 million Jewish deaths is on his shoulders. But what's weird about it is the responsibility for thousands of Jewish lives is also on his shoulders. So it's a very, very strange story. Adolf Eichmann was the one assigned by the Nazis to figure out how to get around British immigration policy. So, before the Wannsee Conference, what he would do is say, Zionist Federation, figure out how to get me a boat in Romania. Get me a boat to Romania, and I'll get you Jews. And that's what they did. Over and over and over. And then it was up to the Zionist Federation to try and get the boats around the British. So there's one boat, you maybe have heard of it, called the Patria. The Patria was one of these boats that got stopped, and all the refugees were going to be sent to Cyprus. And so what the Zionist Federation decided to do is they said, you know what, we'll make them feel really bad. We'll make the international community feel really bad for these refugees. So they put explosives on the side of the boat, and they blew holes in it, and it began to sink. And the Zionist Federation said, so what are you going to do now? Are you going to save these people as they're sitting on the coast of Palestine? The Patria and the people on it are the only ones that the British, that they knew about, the only boat that they let through during the war. It's kind of crazy. All right, well, that then begins to become unsuccessful because the British keep catching the boats, right? So Eichmann is taken off of this and told, you know what, never mind, this isn't going to go. Instead, Hitler develops a new plan. And he says, here's what we're going to do instead. Forget the whole idea of getting them to Palestine, we're going to get them to Madagascar. So he conquers France in 1940. Madagascar was French. So he has this big grand plan to deport all the Jews to Madagascar, essentially making this huge concentration camp out of an island, right? He figures if they're in an island, then they can't do anything to anybody. So he's going to put them all there. His only problem is, again, right, the British rule the seas. So he says, I don't know what to do, right? I can't get them to Madagascar. I own Madagascar, but I can't get them there somehow. So that plan then gets scrapped. Right, the whole Madagascar thing, and instead Hitler gives this speech It's one of his most famous ones. I don't know if you've ever heard of it before, but it's where he stands up in front of the Reichstag and he says, "I will today be a prophet." Right? If worldwide Jewry decides to plunge the world into a second world war, that will mean their extermination. And that's the point at which Nazi policy turns. Right? Nazi policy had been before, just get them out of Germany. And now he says, if there's another world war, they're all dead. Because it's all their fault. Right? I've tried to be nice. I've tried to help them. Now, clearly, we don't sympathize with Hitler at all. Right? So I hope you don't take that at all from what I'm saying. But this is what he was saying to the people. Right? So this is his speech where he says, essentially, paragraph 1, all these democracies of the world say, oh, we love Jews. We want to help Jews. Well, then why don't you take them, he says. Because, as John talked about, right, with the St. Louis, the U.S. said, we don't want any more. Canada said, we don't want any more. Australia said, we don't want any more. Australia's words were actually, we don't have a Jewish problem and we don't care to import one. The only country in the world, anyone know? The only country in the world that said, we'll take Jews? Japan. Not Japan. They did take Jews, but it was done without the knowledge of the government. China does take some, but that wasn't really a choice. Shanghai was an international city, so it was open to anybody. It was the Dominican Republic. But that's actually a weird story too, because it was the Dominican Republic, and the president was Rafael Trujillo, and the reason that he wanted Jews, right, this is real strange, the reason that he wanted Jews is because he had just committed genocide against the native population, and he wanted to refill the Dominican Republic with white people, right? So he says, send me 10,000 Jews. So it's real weird, right? The 19th century, or the 20th century was a really strange period, right? But that all connects to what I was talking about with the development of racism, right? Racism is very strongly connected to genocide. So this is what Hitler says. Now, here's how I want to wrap up. So that's how things change. Okay, let me get to Israel. All right, here's the end. So what we have seen here is, weirdly enough, right, Great Britain stands up and it says, Balfour Declaration, we're going to do a homeland, and then it says, wow, this is like basically impossible. Like, back up, you know, how are we going to do this, right? So they don't know what to do. Germany, like the nation that wants to kill all the Jews, ends up getting used to save them, right? And I feel like you just look at this and you're like, wow, like this is astonishing what God is doing here. Like his will is going to happen no matter what. Right? And he's even going to use the biggest anti-Semite in the world to make his will happen. So what takes place then is, after the Holocaust, you get displaced persons camps. I don't know if you've ever talked to somebody who lived in one of those, or who is from one, but what's weird about them is, essentially, you have all these Jews throughout Europe who are in concentration camps, and the Allies don't know what to do with them when they liberate the camps. So we often think, oh, the Holocaust is over, you know, the US came in, or Russia came in and liberated the camps. It wasn't like that, right? Because all of a sudden, here's these people, and they don't know where to go, because they can't go back to their homes in Poland, because Polish people are living in their homes now. And when people did do that, they got killed. So that's the Jedwabne massacre, right, if you've ever heard of that. A bunch of Jews came back to their village in Poland, they survived the Holocaust, and they got killed when they knocked on the door of their homes. People said, oh, you're still alive? So, I mean, that shows you what was going on. So the Allies created what they called displaced persons camps, but the problem is that they didn't know where to put the Jews. So guess where they put them? In the concentration camps, right? They left them there because there was no place. So they left them in the concentration. You can see the barbed wire, right? They left them in the concentration camps. The big difference is they didn't treat them as slaves, right? And they gave them food. So yes, it was different, but still, these people were kind of like, well, we were kind of hoping it would be better, right? So the US, President Truman, says, okay, we have all these Jewish refugees, we don't know what to do with them, and I heard, he says, that you're keeping them in concentration camps. He says, that's outrageous. So he sends over one of his officials named Earl Warren, and he says, you go check this out, and you tell me what's happening. So Earl Warren writes up a report about the displaced persons camps. Here's the beginning of his report. He says, generally speaking, 3 months after VE Day, and even longer after the liberation of individual groups, Many Jewish displaced persons and other possibly non-repatriables are living under guard behind barbed wire fences in camps of several descriptions built by the Germans for slave laborers and Jews, including some of the most notorious of the concentration camps, amidst crowded, frequently unsanitary, and generally grim conditions, in complete idleness, because they weren't being worked as slaves, with no opportunity, except surreptitiously, to communicate with the outside world, waiting, hoping for some word of encouragement and action in their behalf. While there has been marked improvement in the health of survivors of the Nazi starvation and persecution program, there are many pathetic malnutrition cases, both among the hospitalized and in general population of the camps. The death rate has been high since liberation, as was to be expected. One army chaplain, a rabbi, personally attended, since liberation, 23,000 burials, 90% Jews, at Bergen-Belsen alone, one of the largest and most vicious of the concentration camps, where, incidentally, despite persistent reports to the contrary, 14,000 displaced persons are still living, including over 7,000 Jews. At many of the camps and centers, including those where serious starvation cases are, there is a marked and serious lack of needed medical supplies. What he went down in history as saying is, we appear to be treating them the same way the Germans treated them, except we don't kill them. That's the Exodus, 1947. What happens is, nobody's sure what to do with the displaced persons. So people start taking surveys and saying, what do you want to do? Right? You can't go home. So where do you want to go? Some people say we want to go to the US, right? Or we want to go to Canada. Far and above, people say we want to go to Palestine. That's the point that people had to get to. Right? We saw it yesterday when Theodore Herzl said, Uganda, right? And the Russian delegation ripped down the map and said, we don't care if we die, we're going to Palestine. They had to get to that, right? And so the surveys come back and they say, list your first choice. Few people say the US, few people say Canada, few people say, a lot of people, most people, the majority say Palestine. It then says, pick your second choice. Hundreds of survivors write back, crematorium. That was where they were at. Send us to Palestine or kill us. Right? That's the only place we want to be. And so, what you get is in 1947, these survivors go out throughout the world and they start lobbying on behalf of the state of Israel. The UN vote is coming up for the partition plan, and no one knows which way it's going to go. So they start going to the delegates of all the different countries and saying, this is the only place we want to be. This is the only place. And that is the point that they had to get to. Now, we know what happens. 1947, the vote takes place, and the state of Israel is born. Now, we have looked in these 5 classes at all this Jewish history, and what I hope that you can take from that is that the hand of our God is not stopped. And I think that it's fascinating, it's phenomenal to see that here's a nation that is scattered and destroyed at AD 70, and you'd say, oh, they're never going to come back from that. But they come back in 135, right? And they have an independent state for 3 years. And then they get totally scattered. In fact, the whole nation is renamed so that they can't even exist there anymore, right? The power of the Roman Empire says, you will never go here again, and we will erase the memory of you by renaming it Palestine. But 1900 years later, they're back. Despite the fact that Great Britain tried to prevent the immigration, despite the fact that the Nazis killed 6 million of them, our God does not lose. He will do what he has said. And so in seeing this, let's just remember the confidence that we can have. We don't know how he's doing it. We don't always know when he's going to do it, but we know he will fulfill what he has said.